His face slammed against the hood of the police cruiser, gravel grinding into his skin. 5 officers laughed as they pulled his arms too far back, the cuffs cutting into raw flesh. On the ground beside him, his work badge, face down, unread. To them, he was just another suspect, just another danger. What they didn't know, the man they brutalized wasn't only innocent. He was about to control their futures in ways they couldn't even imagine. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The smell of scorched asphalt and sweat hung heavy in the air as Eric Lawson waited outside the downtown Atlanta mall, scrolling through emails on his phone. His dark suit clung to his back in the humid August heat. The job interview had gone better than expected. Vice President of Legal Affairs, not bad for a 32-year-old black man from the South Side. He checked the time. His rideshare driver was 2 minutes away. He didn't notice the patrol car slowed down across the street. He didn't see the 2 officers inside exchange a glance. He didn't hear the click of the radio as they called in a suspicious individual near the main entrance. But he felt it. That heavy, burning stare. The weight of judgment without cause. Eric kept his posture relaxed, careful. Hands visible. Body language non-threatening. Every move precise, habits drilled into him from a lifetime of living while black in America. The cruiser pulled up sharply, tires screeching. 2 officers jumped out. White, mid-30s, aggressive from the first step. "Hey," one barked, hand already hovering near his holster. "What are you doing here?" Eric blinked, caught between confusion and the cold flash of instinctive fear. "Waiting for my ride," he said evenly, voice low. The second officer, stockier, red-faced, stepped closer, sizing him up like prey. "Yeah," he sneered. "Mind showing us some ID?" Eric hesitated. Legally, he knew he didn't have to. No reasonable suspicion. No cause. But refusing could escalate. It always escalated. Wordlessly, he reached into his jacket, slowly, carefully, and produced his wallet. Before he could flip it open, the first officer lunged, grabbing his arm and yanking him forward roughly. "Keep your hands where I can see him," he shouted. Eric stumbled, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I'm complying," he said firmly. "I'm complying." It didn't matter. The stocky officer grabbed his other arm, twisting it up behind his back until pain shot up to his shoulder. Eric gasped but didn't resist. In an instant, his body was slammed against the hot metal of the patrol car. The cuffs snapped tight around his wrists too tight. By now, people had started to notice. A few pulled out phones but stayed at a safe distance. No one intervened. Eric's wallet, and his badge, fell to the ground. Neither officer bothered to pick it up. "You fit the description," the red-faced cop muttered. Eric's voice was tight. "What description?" The officer didn't answer. Because there wasn't one. As the cuffs dug deeper into his skin and the world blurred at the edges of his vision, Eric realized 2 things. They hadn't even checked who he was. And soon, they would wish they had. The backseat of the cruiser was small, hot, and stank of old sweat and fear. Eric shifted against the hard plastic seat, his wrists throbbing painfully inside the cuffs. Neither officer said a word as they drove. They didn't need to. Their silence was louder than shouting. The kind of silence that came when men knew they were in control and believed there would be no consequences. The car swerved onto a side street, pulling behind a row of abandoned warehouses. No cameras. No witnesses. Eric's mouth went dry. The cruiser stopped sharply. The red-faced officer, name tag reading Barnes, yanked the door open. "Out," he barked. Eric moved carefully, every muscle screaming. The second officer, a younger man with a sharp jawline, Keating, his badge red, shoved him roughly toward a crumbling brick wall. Barnes leaned in close, breath sour with coffee and something rotten. "You know what your problem is," he said, voice low. "You people think you own the world now." Eric said nothing. He kept his jaw tight, eyes steady. Barnes grabbed his lapel and ripped it open, sending Eric's folder of documents spilling across the filthy ground. Keating laughed, kicking papers across the gravel. Eric's offer letter. His professional certifications. His spotless background check. All scattered like trash. Barnes leaned closer. "You think a fancy suit makes you better than us?" Keating circled behind Eric, jabbing a finger into his ribs. "Maybe we ought to remind you who's in charge." Eric fought to stay calm, but inside, fury burned white-hot. He could almost hear the lectures from his father, from his grandfather. Stay still. Stay quiet. Survive first. Fight later. Barnes shoved him hard against the wall. Gravel bit into his palms. Pain blossomed across his shoulder where the cuffs dug in. "You're lucky we don't run you in for resisting," Barnes growled. Keating pulled out his phone, smirking as he filmed Eric pinned against the wall. "For the report," he said mockingly. "Make sure it looks good." Eric closed his eyes for a brief second, grounding himself. This wasn't new. This wasn't surprising. But this time, they had picked the wrong man. Because even now, his mind was working, calculating, memorizing. Patrol car number, time and location, exact words spoken, every second recorded in his mind with surgical precision. Barnes finally released him with a shove that sent Eric stumbling to the ground. "Get lost," he snapped. "Next time, it'll be worse." Keating tossed Eric's scattered documents after him with a snicker. Eric knelt silently, gathering the crumpled papers with trembling hands. Neither officer noticed the gleam of a specific badge tucked among the mess, a Department of Justice Internal Affairs credential. Neither of them realized who they had just assaulted. Not yet, but soon, very soon. And when that moment came, there would be no side streets, no dark alleys, no laughing, only consequences. Real, permanent consequences. Eric watched the patrol car peel away, tires screeching as it disappeared into the distance. Dust settled slowly around him, clinging to his torn suit and bleeding palms. He rose to his feet carefully, every movement controlled. No sudden gestures. No mistakes. Not now. Not yet. He brushed dirt from his documents with slow, deliberate hands, folding them back into the leather portfolio that still bore his DOJ Internal Investigations badge tucked discreetly inside. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Eric pulled out his phone. Despite the officer's manhandling, it was intact. He tapped a number. No contact name, just a string of digits. One ring. Two. Lawson. A voice answered crisply. Status. Eric kept his voice low. Calm. Contact made, he said. Confirmed hostile engagement without provocation. Physical force used. No charges stated. No rights read. A pause on the line. Understood, the voice said. Proceed to next phase. Eric hung up without another word. He slid the phone into his pocket and started walking toward the main road. His shoulder throbbed with every step, his wrist swollen and burning, but he welcomed the pain. It sharpened his focus. Every second of today had been documented. His GPS location, his appointment time, the mall's security cameras. There would be no misunderstanding, no different version of events. There would only be facts. And facts were lethal when aimed correctly. As he walked, a battered city bus rumbled into view. Eric flagged it down, boarding without a glance at the curious driver. He dropped a few coins into the machine and sank into a cracked plastic seat at the back. The ride into downtown was slow, crawling through Atlanta's early evening traffic. Eric kept his gaze steady out the window, but his mind was moving faster than ever. He knew how this would play out. Barnes and Keating would file a report full of lies. They would paint him as agitated, threatening, maybe even combative. They would think no one would question it. They always thought that. Because the system had taught them there were no consequences, not for men like them, and certainly not for victims like him. Eric's jaw tightened. Not this time. As the bus rattled past downtown skyscrapers, Eric's destination came into view. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, Internal Affairs Division. He pulled the chain to signal his stop. He stepped off the bus, portfolio clutched tight in his hand, and walked toward the glass doors with a limp that only fueled his determination. Inside, a security guard nodded and buzzed him through without question. They knew him here. They had been waiting. Agent Valerie Knox, head of the regional DOJ task force, met him at the elevators. She took one look at the ripped suit, the bruised wrists, and the blood staining his knuckles. Her face went hard. They touched you, she said quietly. Eric nodded once. Good, Knox said, her voice cold. Then we don't just have a case. She handed him a sealed file stamped with the Department of Justice crest. We have a reckoning. Eric accepted it without a word. Tomorrow morning, warrants would be signed. By tomorrow night, Barnes and Keating wouldn't just be suspended. They'd be fighting for their freedom. And for the first time, they'd realize. Their victims had names. And those names had power. Morning arrived with a sky the color of steel. Eric stood outside the Fulton County Courthouse, portfolio in hand, the bruises on his wrists stark against his cuffs. Inside the courthouse walls, the real storm was gathering. By 9 a.m., the Internal Affairs Task Force had filed for emergency warrants. By 9:30, Judge Monroe, a former federal prosecutor with no tolerance for misconduct, had signed them without hesitation. Now, it was time. Eric entered the courthouse lobby, where Valerie Knox and two other DOJ investigators waited. She handed him a slim black folder. 2 counts each, she said. Civil rights violations. Assault under color of authority. Obstruction of justice. Eric flipped the folder open, scanning the arrest affidavits. Every word had been crafted carefully, no emotion, no rhetoric. Just facts. Cold, undeniable facts. This is enough, Knox said quietly. But if they resist, we'll add resisting arrest to their charges. Eric tucked the folder under his arm. They won't resist, he said calmly. Because bullies never fought when real power showed up. They only knew how to crush those they thought were powerless. At 10 a.m., Eric and the task force arrived at the downtown precinct. The sight of the black SUVs pulling up in formation stopped conversations mid-sentence. Officers outside dropped cigarettes and scrambled to alert the inside. By the time Eric stepped through the front doors, Barnes and Keating were already standing behind the front desk, confusion turning quickly into panic. Barnes spotted him first. His face twisted. You, he barked, disbelief dripping from his voice. You filed a complaint? Eric met his stare without blinking. No, he said. I filed charges. 2 federal agents stepped forward, badges raised. Luke Barnes and Evan Keating, Knox announced, her voice echoing off the marble walls. You are under arrest. The entire precinct froze. Barnes puffed out his chest, trying to salvage control. This is a mistake, he growled. You don't know what you're doing. Keating took a step back, eyes darting toward the exits, sweat already beading on his forehead. Knox didn't flinch. You have the right to remain silent, she said. We suggest you use it. Barnes lunged forward, rage overwhelming his common sense. But Eric moved first. He stepped between Barnes and the door, standing firm, calm. You assaulted an unarmed man without cause, Eric said, his voice low, cutting. You abused your badge. You disgraced your oath. Barnes hesitated, his bravado crumbling. Federal agents seized him roughly, snapping cuffs around his thick wrists. Keating didn't even resist. He just slumped against the desk, hands limp as the second agent cuffed him. The lobby buzzed with stunned whispers. Other officers backed away, unwilling to be associated with the downfall unfolding before them. Eric stepped aside as Barnes and Keating were marched past him, heads down, faces burning with humiliation. Outside, news crews had already gathered, tipped off by anonymous sources inside the courthouse. Cameras flashed. Microphones thrust forward. Barnes and Keating flinched under the attention, the same attention they had wielded so carelessly against others. As they were shoved into separate black SUVs, Eric stood silently on the courthouse steps. No cheers. No applause. Only the heavy, irreversible weight of accountability settling over the city. And it was only beginning. Because justice wasn't just about taking 2 men down. It was about pulling the rod out by the roots and making sure it never grew back. The interrogation rooms at the federal courthouse were stripped of any comfort. Plain metal chairs. Bare walls. Fluorescent lights that buzzed just enough to fray nerves. Barnes sat slumped at the metal table, arms cuffed in front of him. His swagger from the streets was gone, replaced by something colder, fear. Keating sat in a separate room across the hall, head in his hands. Eric stood behind the two-way glass, arms folded across his chest, watching. Valerie Knox appeared beside him. We're starting with Barnes, she said. He's the weaker link. Eric gave a slight nod. His face was a mask, betraying nothing. An agent stepped into Barnes's room and placed a thick stack of documents on the table. Barnes glanced at them, then up at the camera in the corner. You know what that is? The agent said casually. Barnes didn't answer. The agent tapped the folder. That's a compilation of every civilian complaint filed against you in the last 6 years. Every incident where you used force without cause. Every case where your report didn't match body cam footage. Barnes's jaw twitched. The agent leaned in. You assaulted the wrong man yesterday. Eric Lawson isn't just a lawyer. He's a federal investigator assigned to monitor civil rights violations. The words hung heavy in the sterile air. Barnes's bravado cracked. His fingers tapped nervously against the metal tabletop. You're facing federal charges, the agent continued. Multiple counts. Mandatory minimums. No plea deals unless you cooperate. Barnes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. In the hallway, Knox crossed her arms. You think he'll flip? Eric's eyes stayed locked on the scene inside the room. He's a coward, he said. Of course he'll flip. Inside, Barnes finally spoke, voice low and tight. What do you want? The agent smiled thinly. Names, he said. Supervisors. Partners. Anyone who covered for you. Anyone who taught you how to hide it. Barnes hesitated, his eyes darting to the door like a trapped animal. We already know half of it, the agent added. We're giving you a chance to make it easier on yourself. Sweat beaded on Barnes's forehead. Slowly, his shoulders sagged. I'll talk, he muttered. The agent leaned back, satisfied. Across the hall, Keating wasn't doing much better. He had cracked even faster, offering up details without waiting for a deal to be formalized. Names, dates, incidents that had been buried, senior officers who had ordered them to make examples, commanders who had signed off on doctored reports without a second glance. Eric turned from the glass, his hands tightening into fists. It was worse than he had expected. This wasn't about a few rogue cops. It was a culture, a system, and now he had enough to tear it wide open. Knox touched his arm lightly. You're up, she said. Eric nodded once. It was time for the final step. Not just arrests. Indictments. Exposure. Real reform. But first, the truth had to be dragged into the light. And Eric Lawson was going to make sure it happened, personally. The press conference was scheduled for noon, but by 11:30 the marble steps of the federal courthouse were already packed. Reporters with microphones. Cameramen jostling for position. Curious bystanders drawn by the buzz of something big about to happen. Eric stood behind the tinted glass doors, his reflection merging with the chaos outside. He adjusted his tie once, exhaling slowly. This wasn't about pride. This wasn't about revenge. This was about making sure the truth couldn't be ignored. Valerie Knox approached, holding a sheaf of notes. You ready? She asked. Eric glanced at the papers but shook his head. I'll speak from memory, he said. Knox smiled slightly. Good. They'll feel it more that way. At exactly noon, the courthouse doors swung open. Eric stepped into the blinding midday sun, flanked by Knox and two senior DOJ officials. The crowd surged forward. Questions were shouted. Flashes popped like fireworks. Eric moved to the podium set at the top of the steps. He paused, letting the cameras settle. Then, in a clear, steady voice, he began. Yesterday, officers Luke Barnes and Evan Keating were arrested on charges of civil rights violations, assault under color of authority, and obstruction of justice. The murmurs from the press intensified. But the investigation did not end with two individuals, Eric continued. Evidence has revealed a systemic pattern of racial profiling, excessive force, and falsified reports within multiple precincts. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Over the past 6 years, he said, voice tightening, hundreds of complaints were ignored, altered, or buried. Dozens of citizens were unlawfully detained, assaulted, and in some cases permanently injured. Eric's gaze swept over the mass of faces below. He wasn't speaking to the cameras. He was speaking to every person who had ever been dragged from a sidewalk for fitting a description. Every person humiliated, bruised, broken, and told it was just procedure. He continued, each word deliberate. The Department of Justice will be pursuing full criminal prosecution against those responsible. Further, a civil rights consent decree will be issued, mandating oversight, policy reform, and leadership changes across the affected departments. A few reporters scribbled notes frantically. Others just stared, stunned. This is not about a few bad actors, Eric said. This is about a culture that allowed, no, encouraged injustice. He let the silence stretch for a beat. And that culture ends today. Behind him, Knox stepped forward, handing out press packets. Eric fielded a few shouted questions calmly, refusing to let the press twist the moment into politics or drama. Then, with a final nod, he stepped away from the podium. The job wasn't done, not by a long shot. But the first wall had been smashed. As he walked back inside the courthouse, flashes exploding behind him, Eric felt a weight lift from his shoulders, not because the fight was over. Because, for the first time, the fight was happening out in the open. And the truth was louder than their lies. By the end of the week, the city was on fire, not with flames, but with truth. Local news stations ran the footage nonstop. Barnes and Keating being led away in cuffs. Eric's speech replayed every hour. Interview after interview with citizens who had once been ignored now finally heard. Eric sat in a small, dim conference room deep inside the DOJ's Atlanta branch office, surrounded by files, depositions, and taped interviews. It wasn't over yet. If anything, it was accelerating. Valerie Knox entered, a grim smile on her face. They're turning on each other, she said, dropping a thick folder onto the table. Eric opened it. Inside were fresh affidavits, testimony from officers desperate to save themselves, handing over supervisors, commanders, even union reps who had buried complaints for years. Names he recognized. Names he didn't. Some he had even once respected. Eric leaned back in his chair, exhaustion clawing at him, but he forced it down. "There's enough here for grand jury indictments," Knox said. He nodded slowly. "Start the paperwork," he said. All of them. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They both understood what this meant. It wouldn't just be low-level officers facing charges. Captains, chiefs, people who had once been considered untouchable. The backlash would be brutal. Political shields would rise. Media spin would try to paint it as a witch hunt. But Eric didn't care. Because behind every buried complaint, behind every tampered report, there was a real person, someone who had been hurt, silenced, erased. He would not let them be forgotten. By Friday afternoon, federal marshals had raided 3 precincts. Desks were emptied. Hard drives seized. Phones confiscated. The silence inside the departments was no longer arrogance. It was fear. At a hastily called press conference, the interim police commissioner, a man who had once smiled and shaken Eric's hand at civic functions, announced his immediate resignation. Eric watched the news feed from his office, arms folded tightly across his chest. This wasn't about personal victories. This wasn't about career milestones. It was about dismantling a system built to crush people like him, people who had done nothing wrong except exist in the wrong skin. Knox entered again, holding 2 cups of burnt, bitter coffee. She handed one to Eric. "You realize they're going to hate you for this," she said quietly. Eric took the cup but didn't drink. "They already did," he said simply. Knox chuckled dryly. "And you're still standing." Eric looked out the window at the darkening city skyline. "For now," he said. He knew the backlash was coming. Whispers in the hallways. Anonymous threats. Politicians pretending to care while plotting his downfall. But he also knew something else. The truth was out now. And no matter how many hands tried to shove it back underground, it would keep clawing to the surface. Because justice, once awakened, didn't sleep easily. And neither would he. The first real retaliation came on Monday morning. Eric arrived at the DOJ office to find his name plastered across a blog post circulating through back channels, a vicious smear accusing him of misconduct, bias, even fabricating evidence. No sources. No proof. Just poison. Knox was waiting in his office, holding a printout of the post. "They're trying to discredit you," she said flatly. Eric skimmed the article without emotion. "Expected," he muttered. Knox leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Expected doesn't mean harmless," she said. "This will get ugly." Eric tossed the paper onto his desk. It already is. He knew the tactics. When power couldn't win in court, it fought in the shadows. Phone calls were made. Old acquaintances grew cold. Doors that had once opened easily now stuck halfway. And still, he didn't stop. Every morning, Eric arrived at the courthouse early. Every night, he left long after the hallways were empty. Deposition after deposition. Grand jury testimony. Subpoenaed bank records showing bribes and payouts linked to falsified reports. The deeper they dug, the uglier it got. Meanwhile, Barnes and Keating, facing mounting federal charges, finally broke completely. Through their attorneys, they offered full cooperation, rolling over on everyone involved. Testimony spilled out like oil. Senior officers ordering illegal stops. Sergeants instructing patrolmen to make stats by targeting black teenagers. Union reps threatening officers who tried to report misconduct. It wasn't just a few bad apples. It was the orchard. Eric sat late one evening reviewing the thick files of evidence, the overhead lights buzzing softly above him. A knock on his door broke the silence. Knox entered, a small folder in hand. "This just came in," she said. Eric opened it. Inside was a letter handwritten, shaky, from a mother whose son had been arrested 2 years earlier by Barnes and Keating for resisting arrest. Her son, barely 18 at the time, had spent a year fighting charges fabricated from nothing. The letter wasn't long, just a few paragraphs. But the last line caught Eric's throat like a fist. "No one ever believed us. Until now. Thank you." He closed the folder slowly, hands steady but heart pounding. This was why he fought. Not for news coverage. Not for reputation. For every voice that had been silenced. For every parent who had buried their anger because no one listened. He stood up, pushing his exhaustion aside. Tomorrow would bring another round of indictments. Another wall would crack. Another lie would shatter. They could smear his name. They could drag him through the mud. It didn't matter. He wasn't backing down. Not until every single name connected to the corruption was dragged into the light. And not until every last victim had a piece of justice that could never be stolen again. By the time the second wave of arrests hit, the city couldn't ignore it anymore. Local news anchors stumbled over their words trying to explain how nearly half a police district's leadership had been indicted. Council members scrambled for damage control. The mayor issued carefully worded statements about moving forward and new beginnings. But the people? They remembered. Outside the federal courthouse, families who once sat silently in the back rows of courtrooms now lined the steps, not shouting, not protesting, just watching, waiting. Inside, Eric sat at the prosecution table, files stacked neatly beside him. Today wasn't about Barnes or Keating anymore. Today was bigger. Captains, deputy chiefs, even a former police commissioner, all facing arraignment. The marble courtroom buzzed with tension as one by one, the defendants shuffled in. Their suits couldn't hide their panic. Their lawyers whispered urgently at their sides. Eric remained still, his expression unreadable. Judge Monroe called the court to order. The first defendant stood. "How do you plead?" "Guilty," came the broken reply. The second stood. "Not guilty," he snapped, defiant. It didn't matter. Eric knew what was coming. For every denial, there was video. For every lie, there were paper trails. For every false report, there was a victim ready to testify. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was a reckoning. As the session dragged on, Eric felt a presence beside him. Valerie Knox had slipped into the gallery, watching silently. Their eyes met briefly. No words were needed. They had broken the wall. Now they would tear down the foundation. After court adjourned, Eric stepped into the heavy summer air outside. The reporters swarmed instantly, shouting questions. He raised a hand once, not to silence them, but to signal that he wasn't running. He walked steadily down the courthouse steps, feeling the weight of every eye on him. Some hostile, some grateful, most just stunned. Knox caught up with him at the sidewalk. "There's going to be hearings," she said quietly. "Oversight committees. Maybe even congressional attention." Eric nodded, unsurprised. "They'll try to spin it," Knox warned. "They'll say it's just a few. That the system works." Eric glanced over at the courthouse behind him. "It doesn't work," he said flatly. "Not unless we make it." Knox smiled grimly. "And you're making it." Eric didn't smile back. Because he knew the truth. The system didn't change because it wanted to. It changed because it was forced to. By pressure. By evidence. By refusing to be silent. He tucked the latest court orders under his arm and started walking away. Tomorrow, another precinct would be reviewed. More files would be seized. More shadows dragged into daylight. Because this wasn't the end. It wasn't even close. Justice wasn't a moment. It was a movement. And Eric Lawson wasn't going anywhere. The old command structure of the police department had been gutted. New leadership, new policies, mandatory federal oversight written into every corner of daily operations. But change wasn't easy. And it certainly wasn't pretty. Eric sat alone on a bench outside the new Civilian Review Board office, a building that hadn't even existed a year ago. The fall breeze carried the sharp scent of autumn, stirring papers across the sidewalk. He stared across the street at the police headquarters, gleaming in the afternoon sun. Different faces, different promises, but the scars remained. He rubbed his wrist absently, a phantom reminder of those handcuffs, of the moment this all started. Knox appeared beside him, handing him a coffee without a word. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the city breathe. "You made history," she said finally. Eric shook his head slightly. "We made a start," he corrected. She smiled at that, a rare, genuine one. "The DOJ wants you to take a promotion," Knox said. "Washington, Senior Oversight Division." Eric let the offer hang in the air. He had thought about it. DC would be safer. Bigger platform. More resources. But the streets of Atlanta called louder. The small victories. The long battles. The faces of families who now dared to hope when before they had only endured. He sipped his coffee, thinking. "I'm staying," he said finally. Knox didn't look surprised. "You're stubborn," she said with a shrug. "I'm needed," he replied. She stood, tossing her empty cup into a trash bin. "Come on," she said. "New cadet graduation starting. You should see it." Eric rose, stretching out the stiffness in his back. Across the street, young recruits in crisp uniforms gathered for the ceremony. Faces of every color, standing side by side, ready to serve a city still healing. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was real. Earned. Fought for. Eric crossed the street with Knox at his side, the weight of the past heavy but no longer suffocating. He wasn't naive. There would be new battles, new attempts to slide back into old habits. But now the city knew someone was watching, someone who wouldn't be intimidated, someone who remembered. He glanced up at the building's new plaque. Atlanta Department of Public Safety, serving all equally. The words mattered, because for too long, they hadn't. As the new officers took their oaths, Eric stood at the back of the crowd, hands clasped loosely behind his back. No cameras on him, no speeches, no applause, just quiet, stubborn victory, and the unshakable knowledge that in a world determined to forget, he had forced them to remember, and he would keep doing it. One case, one voice, one justice at a time. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire action and hope.